She was there when the sun went down. By the time it rose again, she was gone. No farewell, no struggle witnessed by anyone who could speak. Just a door, a darkness, and a figure in a mask moving through the night like a shadow that had somewhere to be. What that figure wanted, where they went, and what they did next, that is a question that has haunted an entire nation. Because the woman inside that house wasn't just anyone. She was somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother, and to millions of people who watch the morning news with their coffee still warm, she was family in the way only television can make a stranger feel like family. 84 years of life, 84 years of memories, of love, of ordinary mornings just like the one that became anything but ordinary. And in the space of a few dark hours, all of it was interrupted by something so calculated, so cold, so deliberate, that even seasoned investigators would later struggle to find the words for it. Then came the notes. Words on paper that made stomachs drop. Words that didn't just suggest something terrible had happened, they described it. Calmly, almost casually, as if whoever wrote them wanted the world to know they were in control, and that Nancy Guthrie was not. And just when the family thought it could not get any worse, their phones lit up. A demand. Digital money. A clock. Invisible, but deafening. And somewhere out there, a man sitting in California who may have known absolutely nothing, but decided that a grieving family's worst nightmare was his opportunity. This case will disturb you. It will frustrate you, and it may very well break your heart. So before we go any further, please be aware. What you are about to hear contains details that some viewers may find deeply unsettling. We do not take that lightly. We never do. If you are new here, welcome to Unsolved Files, the place where we don't look away. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a case, and drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you are watching from. Now, let's talk about Nancy Guthrie. Saturday, January 31st, 2026. Nancy had spent the evening with family, a normal dinner, the kind that happens every week in millions of homes across the country. Nothing about that night gave anyone a reason to worry. At approximately 9:50 p.m., her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, pulled up to her home in the Catalina foothills and dropped her off. Tommaso is married to Nancy's eldest daughter, Annie. He watched her go in. He drove away. That moment, that completely ordinary good night, is the last confirmed time anyone who loves Nancy Guthrie saw her alive. What came next was not ordinary, not even close. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy's Nest doorbell camera disconnected. Not a technical glitch. Someone was at that front door, and they were working deliberately. Surveillance footage later recovered by investigators showed a masked figure attempting to knock the camera off its mount with light, repeated taps. When that did not work, the figure reached for a potted plant nearby and used its foliage to cover the camera lens. Methodical. Practiced. This was not someone acting on impulse. The figure was armed. Investigators later identified what appeared to be a gun sitting improperly in a holster on the suspect's body. He came to that house prepared. At 2:28 a.m., something else went silent. Nancy's pacemaker app lost its connection to her phone, the phone she had left inside the house. For investigators, that disconnection became one of the most important timestamps in the entire case. It marked the window when Nancy was almost certainly no longer in that home by choice. Sunday morning arrived. Nancy did not appear for a virtual church service she attended regularly. A member of her congregation noticed her absence and reached out to the family. That call set everything in motion. Relatives arrived at the house around 11 a.m. They searched inside. They checked the property. No Nancy. No signs of where she had gone. But everything she needed was still there. Her phone, her medication, her belongings. Nothing taken except her. At noon, the family called 911. Deputies arrived at 12:15 p.m. What they found at the front door stopped the investigation from being treated as anything other than what it was. Blood. A trail of it, beginning at the front entrance and leading to the edge of the driveway. It was later confirmed to be Nancy's. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos made it official. This was not a missing person case in the traditional sense. Nancy Guthrie had been abducted from her own home. The investigation was now open, and the clock was already running. The moment Sheriff Chris Nanos classified this as an abduction, the response scaled up fast. This was no longer a local missing person report handled by a handful of deputies. Within days, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was working alongside the FBI, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and specialized search and rescue teams. Every agency brought resources. Every agency brought urgency. Because in a case like this, the first hours matter more than anything that comes after. Investigators fanned out across the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, canvassing homes, knocking on doors, asking questions. They visited gun shops across Tucson, checking records, looking for any transaction or interaction that might connect to the suspect caught on Nancy's doorbell camera. They pulled surveillance footage from residences, businesses, and government cameras in the surrounding area. And then they sat down and watched thousands of hours of it, frame by frame, slowing each clip down to look for anything that did not belong. Because of how close Tucson sits to the U.S.-Mexico border, investigators did not limit their reach to Arizona. U.S. Border Patrol agents were briefed. Mexican law enforcement authorities were brought into the loop as a standard precautionary measure. If someone had moved Nancy across that border, they needed eyes on both sides. Back in the air, investigators deployed a signal sniffer, a device capable of detecting low-power electronic signals, including those emitted by pacemakers. It was mounted on a helicopter and flown slowly at low altitude over the search area. The hope was straightforward. Nancy had a pacemaker. If she was out there, the device might find her. No confirmed detection was reported. On the digital side, the FBI reached out directly to Google. Nancy's Nest doorbell camera did not have an active paid subscription at the time of the abduction, which meant footage was not being stored to the cloud in the usual way. But data does not simply disappear. The FBI worked with Google to extract whatever metadata remained from the device, and that effort would eventually produce the most significant visual evidence in the entire case. On February 10th, FBI Director Kash Patel released black and white images from that doorbell camera on social media. The images showed the masked suspect clearly, but the release created immediate friction. Investigators on the ground in Tucson believed one of the images Patel posted, showing the suspect without his backpack, may not have been from the night of the abduction at all. It may have been from a prior visit, possibly as early as January 11th, suggesting the suspect had surveilled the home weeks in advance. Patel had not coordinated the release with local investigators, and details they had wanted held back were now public. On February 12th, a formal physical description was released. Male, average build, 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10, wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack sold exclusively at Walmart. Investigators visited at least one Walmart location in Tucson to review sales records and in-store surveillance. The FBI's Phoenix field office received over 13,000 tips in the first month alone. Fabian Pacheco, chief of detectives for the Pima County Attorney's Office and one of the tip line overseers, put it plainly when he spoke to CBS News. He said about 10% of tips carry real investigative value, but it only takes one. The FBI's command post later moved from Tucson to Phoenix to allow for more efficient long-term operations. Investigative teams, evidence recovery units, and SWAT remained on the ground in Tucson. If you are not subscribed to Unsolved Files yet, now is the time. This investigation is still active, and we will be here when something breaks. Hit subscribe so you are the first to know. While investigators worked the streets and the tip lines, a parallel battle was being fought in the laboratories, and that battle would eventually become a story of its own. The physical evidence collected from Nancy's home was significant from the start. Blood was confirmed at the front door and inside the house, all matching Nancy. A trail of it told investigators something about how she left. Not on her own terms, not calmly, and not without a struggle. Forensic analysts examined the pattern carefully. Based on the nature and position of the blood drops, experts noted that at some point during the incident, Nancy's face had been very close to the ground, within roughly a foot. Whether she was on her knees, hunched over, or down on the ground entirely, the evidence pointed to a violent and disorienting encounter. Beyond the blood, investigators collected a single strand of hair from inside the home. They also gathered DNA from the property that did not match Nancy or anyone known to have been in regular contact with her. An unidentified male DNA profile was among the samples recovered. Outside the home, the search expanded. Investigators collected 16 gloves from the surrounding area during their canvassing. Most were quickly ruled out. One pair, found approximately 2 miles from the house, drew serious attention. The gloves appeared to match those worn by the suspect in the doorbell camera footage. DNA was extracted and tested. It returned no match in CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, holding over 19 million criminal offender profiles. Later, a separate pair of gloves that had also generated investigative interest was traced by DNA to a local restaurant worker who had no connection to the case whatsoever. Then came the dispute that complicated everything. Sheriff Chris Nanos sent the DNA evidence to a private laboratory in Florida, one his department had a prior working relationship with. The sample sat there before eventually making its way to the FBI's facility at Quantico, Virginia. The delay, measured in months, drew a sharp public response from FBI Director Kash Patel. He stated the FBI had been kept out of the investigation for the first 4 days, a claim he described as critical given that the first 48 hours of any disappearance are the most important. He added that Quantico was the best lab available and that he had an aircraft ready to move the evidence overnight the moment it was offered. Sheriff Nanos pushed back firmly. His office stated that an FBI task force member had been present at the scene the very night of the disappearance and that the Bureau was notified promptly by both local law enforcement and the Guthrie family. Evidence decisions, the statement said, were made based on operational needs. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche stepped into the public dispute and told News Nation that reports of friction between the two agencies were overstated. He said the FBI had worked closely with local law enforcement from day one, but the friction had real consequences. Criminal defense attorney Joshua Schiffer told Newsweek that DNA evidence processed across 5 separate laboratories, which is what happened in this case, creates chain of custody complexity that any competent defense attorney would scrutinize in a future prosecution. Genetic genealogy testing was eventually pursued to try to identify the unknown profiles, but Sheriff Nanos described that process as encountering challenges. Around the 4-month mark, News Nation senior correspondent Brian Entin, who had spent weeks on the ground in Tucson, reported details of an internal task force meeting. FBI agents and sheriff's detectives working the case full-time had gathered for what sources described as a frank, come-to-Jesus reassessment of where the investigation stood and where it was heading. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffin-Daffer, who had been providing expert analysis throughout, did not back away from her assessment of the case. She called it red hot, pointing to the volume of evidence collected and the ongoing forensic work still underway. No public breakthrough followed that meeting, but the investigation, by every official account, was far from finished. While forensic teams worked the evidence, something else was happening in parallel, and it added an entirely different layer of complexity to an already difficult investigation. Notes started arriving. From early February onward, communications began surfacing at media outlets across Tucson and nationally. Some went to local television stations. Others reached national platforms, including TMZ. The volume of correspondence coming in was significant, and investigators had to make a critical judgment call on each one, real lead or noise. Out of everything that came in, 2 notes were treated by the FBI as potentially credible. According to law enforcement sources, both originated from the same electronic source. That detail mattered. It suggested, at minimum, that whoever sent them had access to consistent information and was not simply guessing. FBI Special Agent in Charge Hyth Janke confirmed publicly that one of those notes carried specific details, a reference to an Apple Watch and a reference to a floodlight at the property. Those were not the kinds of details a random member of the public could have pulled from news coverage. Investigators took them seriously. That first credible note demanded $6 million in Bitcoin. It set a deadline of 5 p.m. on February 6th. That deadline passed without payment or contact. A second deadline of February 9th was set. That one passed too. Then there was the second credible note. This one did not demand money. It claimed Nancy had died shortly after the abduction and that her death was not intentional. The FBI made a decision immediately. They requested the contents of that note be withheld from the public. Their reasoning was specific. If further correspondence came from the same source, they did not want the sender to know what had already been shared. That note stayed out of public view for more than 4 months. It was not revealed until June 22, 2026. What struck investigators and outside analysts alike was what was missing across all of it. There was never a proof of life. There was never direct communication established between whoever sent the notes and the Guthrie family. There was never a clear functioning mechanism through which payment could actually be made. Retired FBI hostage negotiator Lance Leasing noted that real ransom operations are built around control and exchange. A kidnapper needs the family to be able to pay, and they need a way to receive it. None of that structure existed here. Brian Enton, after months of covering the case, said publicly that the ransom, in many ways, simply did not make sense to him. He had revised his own thinking on what this case was actually about. Behavioral analysts went further. They described the pattern of notes not as financially driven, but as control-driven. The behavior of someone who wanted to stay at the center of the story rather than exit cleanly with money. By late June 2026, another anonymous communication arrived. An email claiming the sender possessed a hidden phone containing video footage, photographs, and the full identities and addresses of 2 kidnappers. The FBI was reviewing it. Sheriff Nanos was direct in his assessment. He told reporters the recent notes were in all likelihood fraudulent. The notes had created more questions than answers, and the family was still waiting. While the real investigation pressed forward, someone in California decided to insert himself into it. February 4th, 2026. 3 days after Nancy vanished.